Hello, welcome to this session. Today we're going to talk about egoism and social contract theory. And we're going to talk about them both in terms of consequentialist theories. So to get started, we've mentioned this semester there's three main branches that we're taking a look at in ethics. Meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. For each of these fields of ethics, they deal with different parts, very specific ideas. In normative ethics, which is what we'll be taking a look at today, we're looking at how we deal with conflicts of interest, different theories to help us decide how to deal with the moral dilemma. In meta-ethics, we're talking about the nature of goodness and what goodness itself actually looks like, the foundations of morality, what we mean by using those terms of goodness, whether or not morality is real or an invention, different questions like that, the kind of more philosophical aspect of ethics. And then in applied ethics, we're combining those theories together, the ones that we learn in normative ethics and meta-ethics, to help us solve everyday problems. It really, in a lot of ways, helps us answer how we are supposed to live our life. So looking in normative ethics, which again is where we're going to focus a lot of our attention for next couple of sessions here. Normative theories tell us that there's three different ways we can look at a moral dilemma. So we can evaluate it based off of its consequences. That's what's called consequentialism. We can evaluate it based off of the action itself. And so that links together with deontology, action-based morality. Or we can look at it through the idea of an agency-based morality. And agency-based morality deals with all the different agencies that are involved. Usually we're talking about people when we talk about agency-based ethics. And so we'll take a look at that in a couple of different ways. We'll look at virtue ethics, the ethics of care, feminist ethics, to really get us a good idea of that approach. So in looking at consequentialism, again, the main idea here is that you're looking not at an action itself, but what the action produces. What is the result of the action? And so as far as that's true, if you take a look at this slide really quick, it's two women looking at each other, and the one says to the other, "Son, when life gives you to someone, run, because it's not going to end well." And again, that kind of goes back to what we're talking about when we're talking about perspectivism. With depending on what perspective we're looking at, that really informs a lot of ways the morality that we see behind some things. It's important when we think about consequentialism. There are a number of different perspectives that we can look at to understand consequences. And so it's important to be mindful not just of the consequences that we desire, but of all of the other consequences that exist as well. That being said, I want to, again, just kind of diagram this out so it makes sense for you. Because again, for the next couple of sessions here, we're going to be talking about normative ethics. And so today we're going to look at egoism and social contract theory under consequentialist ethics. We'll talk about utilitarianism in another session. And then we have deontology and agency-based ethics as yet another session for us. So combining all those together, it's easy to kind of get lost, especially since we were maybe talking about meta-ethics at another time period that has other theories there. But for right now, we're going to be focusing on egoism and social contract theory. And so to start off, let's talk about egoism. There are a lot of TV shows that we could point to and be like, hey, there are some clear examples of egoism going on in those shows. I just want to kind of give you this preview view if you're interested in any of these shows. There's a good example of egoism that you can pull out of each one. And if you want to talk a little bit more about that, we certainly can. But that being said, let's go ahead and look at what egoism actually is. Egoism ultimately states that self-interest is a driving moral principle. And so as we look at each theory, it's important to keep in mind kind of three different things. We need to know what the theory is saying, why people believe in that theory, and what are the criticisms of that theory. And so each time that we look at a new theory, you've got to be able to answer those three questions about it. So again, what is the theory itself? Why do people believe it? And what are the criticisms that people make about it? For egoism, what it says is that self-interest is the driving moral principle. It's the main consequence that's sought. And so when we look at actions, we should evaluate them based off of how they serve our self-interest. Egoism is very much opposed to the idea of altruism or self-sacrificial care. There's a couple of different ways that we could define altruism, but for the purposes of class today, I'm going to define altruism as self-sacrificial care. And going back to the readings that we had and the interview that you watched with Ayn Rand, I'd point out the argument that she makes in that interview about the fact that when you start to give yourself up, right, that you start to give up your own interests for the sake or the favor of others, that starts to become cannibalistic. You start to lose yourself. And I have posted here The Incredibles, because The Incredibles do a really good job of kind of positing this philosophy of egoism. If you look at the story of The Incredibles, it's this family of superheroes, but they have to hide their identity. They have to go underground because the society itself has passed a law that superheroes are not allowed to use their superhero strength or elasticity or whatever it is. Right? It has to be hidden because too many people are getting hurt by their use of their incredible powers. And what Ayn Rand points out in the video is a very similar argument, which again is just simply the fact that when we restrain individuals from performing their peak self-interest, we ultimately start erasing a part of their identity, and we start creating a worse version of that individual. Another way of thinking about this is what happens when we ultimately make compromises with people. So I'm sure that many of you have been in this situation before where you and your significant other trying to figure out where you're going to go eat, and one of you wants to go to one place and one of you wants to go to somewhere else. And instead of ending up in either one of those two places, you make a compromise and end up somewhere where neither one of you really want to be. For my wife and myself, sometimes we have this kind of argument about Texas Roadhouse or Olive Garden, and somehow we end up eating at McAllister's, right? Which is neither like Texas Roadhouse nor Olive Garden, right? But somehow we ended up at a completely different place. So egoism says, right, instead of allowing other people to have this much influence on your life, why not advocate for yourself and get the result that you actually want? Within egoism, there's two different versions of it that I want to explore and kind of talk to you about today. The first one is what's called psychological egoism. And psychological egoism says that by nature, you are a selfish individual. Your instincts are selfish. You have this kind of survival capacity to do what it takes in order to self-preserve. And you can't help the fact that you yourself are a selfish individual. There's a couple of different studies that are interesting in this capacity. One's where we look at people who are put in crash simulations. And if you have somebody who is sitting right next to you in a crash simulator, even when you're driving, right, when it's actually a real scenario as well, we find that people who are driving and suddenly someone swerves into their lane, right before the moment of impact, the half seconds as you're trying to make a decision about what to do with your car, your instincts kick in and take over, and you naturally just swerve the car away from yourself and into the person who is sitting next to you. Even if you're consciously trying to swerve away from the car right before it happens, when your instincts take over, you'll do the opposite. And so looking at that, I think it's worth pointing out, worth thinking about to some degree, how true this actually is, right? Like, are we by nature selfish individuals? Ethical egoism takes this a different step, takes it a different way, and says it doesn't actually matter whether or not you are a selfish person. Right? We could argue about whether or not individuals by nature are selfish. Ethical egoism says that on principle, you should be selfish, that you should advocate for your own self-interest. Again, going back to the example I gave about communicating where you want to eat at, this happens all the time with individuals where they don't communicate what it is that they want. They don't allow themselves to enjoy their life. And so what ends up happening is that they end up settling for something far less than what it is that they really want. And so ethical egoism says, like, let's advocate for ourselves. When you communicate for what you want, you end up having a better life. And so it's okay for you to be self-interested. It's okay for you to want different things because right, no one else is going to advocate for you. You are your greatest advocate. Finally, I'll just point out here is, again, when everyone is doing this, when every person is free to pursue their own self-interest, ethical egoism says that makes society a much better place. So again, going back to Ayn Rand for a second, she's well known for this book called The Fountainhead, which is about this main character, Howard Rourke, who is a very gifted architect. And throughout the book, he keeps trying to make these beautiful buildings. And the kind of school of thought surrounding him is that right, there are these classical buildings that make a lot more sense. And the buildings that he makes, like, people find grotesque and they don't like him at all. And so even though he's more talented and more gifted as an architect, because the society doesn't like the buildings that he's creating, they reject him completely. And I would point out, as we think about this a little bit more, there are a lot of different parts of our own life that we can probably think of where we don't allow ourselves to fully pursue our own self-interest. We don't allow people to see every part of ourselves because we're afraid that society will crush it out. And we see lots of people who are talented musicians, talented artists, talented cooks and bakers and all kinds of things, who they decide to settle for something that's more promising instead of pursuing their own interests. And as a whole, society loses out when its most talented members think of themselves as incapable of pursuing the things that will ultimately make them happiest, produce what is in their best interest. So one way we can talk about egoism is also through this game that's sometimes done as a social experiment, where you take $100 and you have two people who are partners, and basically you ask one of them to decide how much money they're going to split of that $100. One of them makes an offer, and if the other partner agrees to that offer, then they get to keep the amount of money that's offered for them. If their partner rejects the offer, then neither of them get anything. And so, right, go ahead and make your offer, decide how much of the $100 you're going to offer the other person, and decide how much of it you're going to keep. And what's interesting is that there's a couple of different situations that occur with this game. So often people think the best strategy is to offer their partner $50 and to keep $50. And as we think about it, it doesn't entirely make sense why we find that as the best strategy. And in fact, if we think about it, people could employ a strategy where they keep $99 and they give $1 to the other person. And the reason why most people don't employ that strategy is because they think their partner is going to reject the offer. But what's interesting about that is that it doesn't seem like a very rational sort of thing. Because again, no matter how much you offer your partner, they're that many dollars richer than what they were before they played this game. So if you go in and you say, hey, I want to give you $1 and I'm going to keep 99, right? They're still $1 richer than what they were beforehand. If you see $1 just on the floor somewhere, like you'll definitely pick that up because like you want to keep it. But somehow when we employ the principle that you are getting $1 at the cost of someone else getting $99, there's this feeling that we have of being cheated out of something that's rightfully ours. And so if we go back to that idea about psychological egoism, a psychological egoist points out to that phenomenon and says, the reason why you feel that way, again, is because you have this selfish instinctual drive within you to advocate for yourself. And so again, when you notice that there's just $1 on the ground, you feel good about it. But when someone offers you $1, knowing that you could have had more, right, and they're taking $99, there's this way in which we feel cheated out of that, even though we are $1 richer, the same way as the other scenario. A lot of marketing companies, use this to their advantage. They will have two products that look very similar to each other, that are just different in size. And what they'll do is that they'll offer the one that seems outrageous at just a slightly higher price than the other one. They've done this before with theaters, where they will have just a regular bowl of popcorn and say, it's $5 or whatever to have that bowl of popcorn. And people will go through and they'll reject the bowl of popcorn. They're like, I'm not paying that much money for one bowl of popcorn. And later on, they'll take a different group of people and they'll have two bowls of popcorn. They'll have one that costs, like the $5 and one that costs $4.50. And the one that costs $4.50 is about half the size as the one that costs $5. And what you see is people start going through and they start ordering the $5 popcorn. And when you ask them about it, why did you take the bigger deal here? They're like, well, it's such a better deal, right? It's only 50 cents more, and look how much more you get. And so interestingly enough here, it seems as though that there is this principle within us to advocate for ourselves, even sometimes perhaps towards our own detriment. In the story of the Ring of Gyges, this is the very question that's being raised in that reading, is that the shepherd starts off and he lacks the power to be able to do exactly what it is that he wants. And so he ends up as a shepherd. But as soon as he finds the throne that allows him to change his fortune, to be able to go undetected and have the power to do what it is that he wants to do, he starts doing something different than being a shepherd. And one of the arguments that's raised there is just simply this idea that the reason why we don't act out of our selfish impulses, the reason why we don't act out of our self-interest a lot of times, is not because we're kind to other people, but simply because we lack the power to be self-interested all the time. We lack the power to be selfish individuals. And so if we are given that capacity to be able to advocate for ourselves, if we're given the capacity to choose for ourselves, we will oftentimes choose something different than what we are currently choosing right now. If you've seen this show that I've got listed down here at the bottom right-hand corner, throughout the show, this bookkeeper who's staring at the girl in the picture, Beck, he constantly says that everything that he's doing in the show, and the reason why the show is called You, is because he says everything that he's doing for her. And so he'll have a moment in the show where he's like, I'm doing this for you, Beck, right? I'm doing this for you. And as the show goes on, at least in the first season, he's forced to concede that some of the things that he's doing isn't for her, but it's really for him. If we go back and think about the story of the shepherd, the same thing's true as well, is that right before the shepherd has the power to be able to do these things, it seems as though he's content being a shepherd because that's his only choice. That's the most power that he has to be able to do that. And again, if we think about that in our own life, we might say that some of the things that we are choosing to do, they're not really choices. It's just simply that we lack the power to be able to choose outside of the choices that we have. And if we had the power to be able to do something different, we would choose something different. And so there's a second thing that kind of goes along with this. And this is a big reason why people believe in egoism in the first place. It's because it's not really hard to figure out what that thing is. We can, debate for a while about different moral principles and stuff. As we go on in this class, you'll see that there are some very sophisticated and elaborate systems of morality that exist. But egoism is really easy. Right? We know what it is that we want. We know what serves our own interests. And so trying to figure out what the final result is, it's pretty easy. In the trolley problem that we had earlier this semester, you know exactly what it is that you want in that situation. And when it doesn't serve your interest and it doesn't really matter to you, you're content to just walk away from the lever altogether and say, that there really isn't a moral obligation that I have to do one particular thing because neither of these serve my interests. But when something is placed on the trolley, right, your mother is going to die if you don't pull the lever or something along those lines, right, we start to realize, okay, well, there's some more skin in the game here. There is something at stake that directly affects me, and so I'm going to do it. And so again, the story of the Reign of Gyges, what's really interesting is that once this person has the power to not get caught, he does every single thing that the king would have done, right? He, in essence, takes over the entire kingdom. We say, the people who are really successful, that's the difference between them and the people who aren't successful, is that they didn't let anything become a barrier to the ladder of success. They didn't let people stop them from reaching their own self-interest. And so they were able to soar at a high height. Last thing that we could throw out here is, again, just that idea that when we stop actually advocating for ourselves, when we stop trying to be our best advocate, then we end up making the world a pretty mediocre place. Because again, the people who settle, right, it doesn't mean anything about their talent. That there are lots of people who are extremely talented who never reach the full potential of their talents because they chose to settle. They chose not to advocate for themselves. And in doing so, they've made the world a much more mediocre existence. Again, just think about this for a moment. In the story of Apple, which is an extremely interesting story, is that you basically have these two main kind of founding members, and there's the person who actually invented the computer and worked on the circuit board, right? Is considered the Woz of Apple, or the Great Woz, if you've ever heard of him, but it's Wozniak. And on the other side is Steve Jobs, who really built a lot of the company and the infrastructure for the company and the distribution process and things like that. And in the beginning, Wozniak, even though he's an extremely talented programmer, didn't really have an interest in turning his circuit boards into a marketable program. He kind of just wanted to keep it as a freelance sort of thing and just share his ideas with other people. And a lot of people kind of read the story of Steve Jobs as coming in and stealing Wozniak's work. But what an egoist would point out is think about what the world would be like if there wasn't a Steve Jobs advocating for the work of Wozniak, right? Or profiteering off of it, if you want to go that route. Right? Like we wouldn't have like the iPhone, we wouldn't have like the world that we live in like today in a large part because there was that advocacy. And so there's plenty of people who are like Wozniak out there who it's like they have a lot of talent and they never find like a Steve Jobs kind of advocate that like is willing to push their talent, willing to push their work for them, and they themselves aren't willing to do that. And so again, it robs not just themselves of a better life, but it robs the world of their talents as well. These two pictures are really interesting of Afghanistan over this last month. And as we look at them, and if you're watching this further in the future than September of 2021, when the Taliban took back over Afghanistan, there's a lot of different people who took two different approaches. Like some people, they stopped their cars in the middle of the road when they heard the Taliban were back, and immediately went to the airport, right? Like they got out of their home, they sold whatever it was that they had, but they ran straight to the airport to get there. And there's other people who they stayed inside their home, and they were like, people are going to come get me, and they're going to take me to the airport. And so as we look at these two photos, there's some people in that top left photo, they're so desperate for their children to get over in the airport that they actually pass their babies over the fence to the soldiers to make the soldiers decide what they're going to do with their babies. They'd rather be separated and give their children a chance to stay in Afghanistan. And on the bottom right-hand side, right, there's all those people who were running on the tarmac, trying to make the plane stop, some of them even attaching themselves to the airplane, willing to stay attached and eventually falling off the plane because it's they want to get out of there one way or the other, they're going to go. And so if we look at that kind of, again, push, that self-advocacy, the people who stayed inside their homes, they're still there in Afghanistan, whether they want to be or not. But the people who decided to go to the airport, not all of them made it, but of the ones who did, it were the ones who self-advocated, the ones that pushed to go to the airport and to get out, and were maybe somewhat ruthless in making sure that they got out. So again, it's a really good example from an egoist perspective of the right choice being the one that aligns with our self-interest. So I'm gonna showcase two main criticisms about egoism. There are clearly many more criticisms that people make about egoism, but the first criticism I want to talk about has to do with what's called the paradox of hedonism. And this basically just says that the continuous pursuit of pleasure ultimately leads us to an unpleasurable end. And if we think about this in terms of addiction, I've got a picture of HBO's Euphoria over here, and it is in large part a story about addiction. We can see that people who become addicted to something, oftentimes they don't start off as addicts. Instead, what happens is that they enjoy doing something, and it brings them a certain level of peace, a certain level of comfort. And in order to sustain that level of peace, to sustain that level of comfort, they have to keep using it at higher and higher rates. I think this show Euphoria is really interesting because the main character, Rue, who is shown here, this is exactly what her story is. As a child, she's extremely disturbed by different things. She turns towards drugs as a way of finding calm, and ends up becoming an addict through that. You learn that in the first 10 minutes of the show, so I'm not giving you any spoiler here or anything like that. And it is primarily a show about addiction. But even something as good as water can be bad for you. There was a long time ago when the Nintendo Wii first came out, there was a radio station that ran this contest that was called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. And in it, a person actually died of water poisoning because they had drank so much water and held their pee for so long. And what ended up happening, what water poisoning is that basically you're slowly drowning your body because your body is meant to expel the water that comes into it. And so what's interesting about that situation is that we can think of water in all of its good capacities, right? Like it helps us in our body in pretty much every single possible way we could think of. And even something as healthy as water ends up being detrimental if we use it too much. And so the paradox of hedonism basically just says anything that we pursue to a pleasurable end, if we don't regulate that, if we don't moderate that, it can lead us to an unpleasurable end. Continuously pursuing it over and over again puts us exactly in the position that we don't want to be in. And so if we apply this to self-interest, it seems like the same thing is true as well. As we pursue our own self-interest without any regulation, without any kind of guidepost, it seems like it actually works against our own interest. In that same vein, I want to talk about the second criticism, which also is the basis for the second theory that we're going to look at, social contract theory. This is a picture of what traffic looks like in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and it is, most people just call it Addis, by the way, right? But it is one of two countries in the world. Ethiopia is one, North Korea is the other, that does not have any traffic lights, does not have any traffic signs. And it can be a real mess to drive from one place to the other when you're in Ethiopia because it's a giant game of chicken. And so some people would kind of point out this is a really good picture of what egoism looks like when there aren't any rules or conditions for it. You've got cars driving one direction, other cars driving the opposite direction. Everybody's turned around, everyone's trying to get to someplace, and it just ends up being one horrible, gigantic mess no matter where you go. And so bearing that in mind, we might also say there's a problem when people advocate for their own self-interest continuously. And that is that sometimes things are dealt with better cooperatively. So in the reading that we had for today of The Prisoner's Dilemma, it really makes this known to us that when there are two or more competitive interests working against each other, egoism as an idea becomes self-defeating, because what works for the person's actual self-interest, right, what produces the maximum kind of result that you're looking for, is in fact cooperation instead of competition. Right? And so the competitors are better arranged if they are cooperating together than if they're competing against each other. And so there's a couple of different things to mention about this. One of them has to do directly with the reading that we had. So there's these two people, Rick and Kyle, who are given this situation where they are guilty of both a robbery and a possession of weapons. However, the detective that catches them does not have enough evidence to convict them of the robbery, and so he really can only charge them with the weapons charge. And so what he decides to do is put them in separate rooms, and each of them have a choice, right? They have the same choice. They can choose to confess what they have done, right, or not confess. And really, what would work for both of their self-interest, like what would be the maximum good for both of them, is if they don't confess. And at that point, the detective only has the ability to really charge them with the weapons charge. But what the detective is going to do is he's going to separate them out into different rooms. And he's going to say, hey, if you confess to the robbery, I will make sure that I give you a less amount of time in jail than your friend does. And you better go ahead and tell me now, because I'm making the same offer to your friend. And once your friend tells me what's going on, the deal's off the table. I'm going to get a confession from one of you. Might as well be you. And of course, the detective tells both of them that. And so, they've got to be able to trust each other to get to that idea of not being found guilty on anything other than a weapons charge. But because they probably don't trust each other, and again, because they're advocating for their self-interest in the situation instead of their self-interest overall, they're most likely both going to confess. And so that actually leads us to the last part of the swear there, where they both end up getting maximum time because they both confessed. And so if they had, again, just cooperated with each other instead of driving towards their competitive interests, they would have produced a better result. We can see this happen all the time in other venues and other places. Prisoner dilemma scenarios pop up all over the world. The reading talks about carbon emissions, and it's absolutely a prisoner's dilemma scenario where all the nations of the world, if they could come together and agree to curb their carbon emissions, we wouldn't have to deal with problems of, the increase in asthma every year, all of these health-related issues that are in large part due to the unbreathability of the air. But what ends up happening is when nations do come together to talk about curbing their carbon emissions, one nation always looks at it and says, like, if you want to, fine, but I need to maintain manufacturing. I need to maintain my competitive edge over all the other countries. And so I am going to not curb my carbon emissions. I'm going to focus on manufacturing. And every country slowly by slowly decides that that's what they're going to do as well. And so the end result is no one ends up curbing their carbon emissions, and everyone is worse off because of it. Other examples that I have here, wage negotiations. You maybe worked for a place that has in their employee handbook the fact that you're not allowed to discuss your wages with anybody else, right? It could be grounds for getting fired immediately. And the reason they have that there is because they don't want employees telling each other what each other makes, because that can drive the price up for each employee. If Bev and Sam know that they relatively make different wages, but both Sam and Bev think that they're better than each other, when they find out what they're making, the other person will demand a higher wage. Homeowners associations are another good example of this, right? Homeowners, in order to keep their price arbitrarily high, agree to abide by certain conditions, certain principles to keep their homes at the same rate. And so you can't paint your house a certain color, or you can't have a certain type of driveway, because even though it's your property, your property affects all the other properties. And so homeowners associations, knowing this, agree to abide by certain standards in order to keep the value for their houses high. Arms races, gas prices, and performance enhancers, you can probably understand the same kind of principle at play there. A lot of different professional organizations have some mandate that you can't use performance enhancers, because ultimately what ends up happening is if one athlete is allowed to use some type of performance enhancer, then what you see is that gives them a competitive edge, and so everyone else starts following suit. And we know that there are a lot of different performance enhancers that really affect the health of individuals. They've been linked to different heart condition problems, different breathing issues. And so instead of forcing athletes to go through this kind of, you have to take a performance enhancer to remain competitive state, for the sake and the health of all the athletes, it's just decided by those associations to just ban them altogether. So again, these are clear examples where either the competitiveness wins out, and so everybody kind of loses, or in this case, cooperation ensues, and so that creates a benefit for everybody else. And so the second thing I want to talk about today deals with this principle. But before I talk about it, I want to kind of backtrack and point out this is not just the foundation for the next theory that we're going to talk about, but it's also a criticism of what we've been talking about in egoism, where again, if you use your self-interest as your main driving principle, it can actually work towards the detriment of your self-interest. So the other theory that we have for today is social contract theory. And social contract theory basically takes this principle of the prisoner's dilemma, and it says, instead of allowing our self-interest to be the main driving principle, we need to change that to the common interest. We want our self-interest to help drive our common interests. And so social contract theorists say that people who are rationally self-interested, That is, people who understand that their self-interest is important to them, but also understand or are willing to do things to drive that self-interest without, you know, looking at all the detriments that presents to them. They will choose to be cooperative when it suits their self-interest. And so then the main consequence that's sought in social contract theory is this common interest as opposed to self-interest. And what's important in keeping this in mind is kind of the balance of two different things. One is that individuals are using their collective interest to gain a benefit, and so you're willing to do certain things that you may not like in order to gain that benefit. People, when they join homeowners associations, some homeowners associations have it written that you can't have pets, and so when they go to join that, they have a decision to make. Do they want to be a member of this homeowners association and willing to give up their pet, or are they going to live somewhere else and keep their pets? And so again, there's a number of different ways in which we can look and say, you know what, this is something that I don't like, but because of the benefit I gain from agreeing to it, I'm willing to stick with it. And so there's that end, that there are certain things that can happen to us in social contract theory that we don't necessarily like, but because they give us a future benefit, we're willing to stick with them. And on the other end is the fact that we make these agreements because we do see that beneficial nature. And so because of that, our moral actions are bound by the agreements that we make. The morality of our actions are bound to our capacity to agree with others, to make agreements with people. And so if you've made an agreement with somebody, even if you wish you hadn't made the agreement, even if you wish that you could take it back or make a different contract, because you have agreed to that contract, you're required morally to stick with it until the contract ends, right? Or there is some manner under which all parties agree it can be ended. So, some of the main reasons why people believe in social contract theory is, first of all, for people who don't really believe that morality exists in the first place, they're still able to see that cooperating with people can produce a certain social good for them. It can produce a certain benefit. And so it's a compelling view of ethics for people who don't believe that morality actually exists, the people who have that kind of anti-realist view, while also still producing something that's beneficial towards society at large. And a constitution, I think, is a really good example of this, where again, people are born into an understanding of having a constitution. They as long as they agree to abide by the law and do what the law requires, they reap the benefits of the law. They can vote, they can own property, they can do all the things that are allowed under the law. And by the same token, when that contract's broken, when people choose to disobey the law, then those rights can be taken away, those benefits can be restricted. Another idea behind this is that it helps us moderate our harmful selfish intuitions. And so, if you look at a company and you see that there's a CEO and that there's also a kind of steering committee, a corporate board, the reason why that's put in place is, even though the CEO may be extremely talented and know a lot of different things, the CEO may take the company to a place that they don't want to go, may force the company into a situation that they don't want to be in. And so you have several different voices on the corporate board helping to steer the right direction of the company. And you see this over and over again with companies where CEOs kind of let the power go to their head. They want to do something where the corporate board has to come back and say, you got to make a choice. Either you got to change, or we're finding a different CEO. And so when you have that common interest, not only is it useful for gaining a larger benefit for individuals, but it's also useful in helping moderate some of those stupid tendencies that people have, or some of those harmful tendencies that people have that sometimes get obsessed with their own power or their own talents or their own capabilities and are unable to see the larger picture there. The final thing I have listed here is that it also helps provide security from certain fears. The more people are on your side, the more people who are in your group, the more secure you feel within your own surrounding. It's the whole idea behind neighborhood watch groups, right? Is that not everyone all the time is going to be at home, but if enough people living in the neighborhood know each other, then when someone comes in that isn't supposed to be there, right, they can be aware of it and know what's going on. Again, the idea here is that we become more secure through our placement with other people and with our agreements that we make with other people. So what are the criticisms about social contract theory, right? What do people have against it? Again, there's a number of different criticisms that we can level against it, but I think two kind of common themes, two common strands here is that, first of all, right, there are people who can afford to break the contract. That is, there are people who are rich and powerful enough that they don't need other people. Machiavelli in The Prince recommends that treaties should be drawn only when it's advantageous to find a moment where they can later be broken. And so if we look at that, people make contracts all the time where they just decide to later on break it and pay the penalty because it doesn't hurt them nearly as much. One of the most effective ads that Hillary Clinton ran in the 2016 presidential campaign was this ad that talked about a piano shop owner who had, when Trump was building the casino in Atlanta, came through and bought out all of his pianos. And so a couple of months went by, and the piano shop owner went to Trump Tower to collect the payment on there. And they told him that they weren't doing as well as what they had thought. And instead of offering this person the money that they had agreed on, they offered him a reduced rate. And they said that if he didn't take the reduced rate, they were going to keep him tied up in litigation for years. And at the end, it might fall down to a jury's decision, and he might collect nothing from it. And at that point, the person had already gone months without an income. He'd sold everything out of his warehouse. And he states in the commercial he didn't feel like he really had a choice. And so again, that's the idea behind the problem with social contracts is if someone has enough money, has enough power to be able to break it, then they're not an even partner to the contract. The other criticism that's leveled against it a lot is that there's some people who they just don't want to join a group of people. They just want to remain individualistic. They want to make their own choices, and they don't like being steered by others into a single decision. If you remember the video that I showed during Perspectivism of that kind of herd mentality where people are standing up and they're not really for sure why they're standing up, but they're just doing that. There's some people who look at that and they say, one of the reasons why I want to maintain my individuality and not join a collective group of people is because I don't want to fall prey to that kind of thinking. I want to always be in charge of my own decisions. And if I sign a contract, if I join a union, if I become a member of a certain group, then that's ultimately going to force me to make decisions that are not my own decisions, and so I don't want to join. So again, those are the two main criticisms that we can level against social contract theory. If you have any questions for me, send me an email. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day.